Before we begin today's celebration, I would like to take a moment to welcome our honored guests. We are pleased to have Lieutenant General Michael Hamill, Commander, Space and Missile Systems Center, and Dr. Wanda Austin, President and CEO, Aerospace Corporation. We are also pleased to have on our panel 5 very distinguished retired officers. Major General Retired Jack Kulpa, who served as the Program Manager of the 417th Weather Satellite Program in support of Corona. Major General Retired Donald Hard, who served as a C-130 recovery pilot and recovered the very last Corona capsule. Brigadier General Retired William King, who served as Director of the Special Projects Office of the Secretary of the Air Force, Los Angeles Air Force Base. Colonel Retired Frank Bazard, who was one of the 4 members of the Corona Air Force Program Office. And Colonel Retired Bob Kleinman, who directed command, control, and communications efforts at the Air Force Satellite Control Facility. We would also like to welcome the many past and current commanders, leaders, friends, and colleagues in the audience with us today. Thank you all for joining us in this celebration. We are gathered here today to celebrate the accomplishments of some of the earliest pioneers of what has now become the Space and Missile Systems Center. This year marks the 50th anniversary of President Eisenhower's final approval of the Corona program. Corona was the world's first photo reconnaissance satellite program, providing crucial information in protecting our national security. Over its lifespan, the program took more than 800,000 search images of denied areas throughout the world. The program operated from August 1960 to May 1972, which incidentally was the same year General Hamill commissioned into the Air Force. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce General Hamill. Sir.
Good morning to everybody, and thank you so very, very much for participating and joining in on our remembrance today. Just to prove that not everything is completely well-oiled here, Captain Bannock, my remarks are going to be real short if you don't bring me my folder. Before I walked in, so we'll kind of stooge around here for a minute or two. There we go. All right. Let me say that when I heard that our young officers, as well as Colonel Sutton and others, as a result of a roundtable meeting that we had some time ago with many of the space pioneers, had suggested that we hold this event, I was absolutely ecstatic. Having spent my entire career in the space business in the Air Force, and having gone back to days when many of the people in the audience here were leading the forefront, the idea of being able to take some time and to commemorate what was one of the real crowning achievements of our military space program, but really the birth of the whole business, and to do so before I was going to be retiring from command here at the SMC. The rest of that was really a joyous opportunity. I have a few comments here. I'm going to kind of kick things off here and kind of set some context for you all, but I have to say a very, very special thanks to many of you who are taking time. I take a look across this audience, and frankly, there are faces, there's remembrance, there's associations. We have General Funk over here, one of the early commanders of the center here, as well as just a myriad, Tom Taverny, as well as Seb Coglator. This is kind of like the who's who of the military and the Air Force space business from over the past 50 years. And so it really is a great pleasure to have so many of you come. And probably more importantly is we got an awful lot of our young officers that now are carrying on from where it is that you all have begun, and likewise where we've carried the business to today. This is indeed the 50th anniversary, and I'd like to remind people that just a few short months ago we marked the first time that humankind actually put objects into orbit. First the Soviet Union, and then shortly after that the United States. And so we really are kind of at that mid-century point of the first 100 years of man's operation in space. And it is a wonderful time and opportunity to kind of reflect a bit upon the past. What does it really mean in terms of our nation's well-being, our national security, and how it is that when our nation asks our young men and women to go to war, how it is we give them every possible advantage in winning the fight. And I'd ask you to think back a little bit as I take a look across the crowd. We got a pretty broad spectrum here, all the way from sort of more senior citizens to younger people. I'd ask you to kind of reel back a little bit. Think about the 1950s and the 1960s. These were some very, very dark hours. We were in a pitched battle with our mortal enemy, the Soviet Union. We had missiles that were pointed at each other that on a moment's notice could have obliterated society and humankind as we knew it. These were very tense moments, and I think many of you can still, in your mind's eye as well as in your emotions, recollect back that time period. And I would point out one of the things that a little bit after the initiation of some of this, there was a wonderful quote by then our President Kennedy. It said, "This country of the United States was not built by those who waited and rested and wished to look behind them. This country was conquered by those who moved forward, and so will space." That was a quote at Rice University in 1962. And you sit and you think about it, is for many years prior to that, men and women there in this room here today indeed already knew what President Kennedy proclaimed to the entire nation. And I'll tell you, there's absolutely no question in my mind probably the ultimate expression of what it has been to really be pushing the forefronts of technology and that pioneering, exploratory kind of spirit was really captured with the Corona program. This was the program that answered the call. It brought together technological wonderments together with an absolute national imperative that was critical to the survival of our nation. And it was a leading effort in terms of our nation's now mastery of space. It helped set the tone and shape the nation's future in terms of how it is we do space business, and it really set the model. Not only was it a crowning achievement in terms of the actual technical and operational performance, but it also created a new culture, a space culture, one in which our Air Force has been at the forefront from the very earliest days. Even before there were such things as NASA and DARPA and other organizations, this team was the one that was really blazing the path into the future. I think you all know, you could write your own individual textbooks about this. What's this culture been about? It's been about that pioneering spirit. It's in effect pushing the boundaries of the unknown, going places where others have never been before. It's about innovation, not being caught in your box or in your lane, but rather looking for different ways to get the job done and not taking no for an answer. It's really courage in terms of pushing the boundaries and being technologically and technically capable. In other words, being master of that which you are working on, not simply hoping that somebody gets it, but rather you indeed were the ones that got it from the very beginning. But you also learn through the School of Hard Knocks that this is one that a business requires discipline. It's not something where you can go off and by the seat of the pants expect to have success. That you have to learn from each and every experience and mistake. You never repeat the same mistake twice. And in the case of Corona, we're going to hear a little bit later on that we tried just about every possible mistake to get to success. But this is part of the culture of this space community. It is one that brought tremendous new practices in terms of how does government industry team and manage technologically complex and risk-fraught efforts, and to manage our way collectively through these in a very rapid pace. Those were all things that were the culture that was set in place with the Corona program and all the related elements of the launch vehicles, the recovery group, the satellite command and control, that to this day are forming the foundation of every success that we have in the business over some 50 years. I touched upon this, that the Corona program was really birthed out of the conjunction of opportunity and imperative. Again, think about the days back in the mid to late 1950s where the basic notion of how it was we were going to be able to maintain a strategic nuclear deterrence, basically threaten each other with annihilation, but to be able, between ourselves and the Soviet Union, to know enough to be able to anticipate what the capabilities and the intentions, such that we would actually have a stable peace which lasted some 50 years without ever having detonation of a nuclear weapon. I would argue that that basic ability to maintain the peace over the last half of the 20th century was largely as a result of the space programs and capabilities. All the way from our ability to count bombers and ICBMs and production at factories throughout the Soviet Union, to how it is we were able to ensure that we could warn of any kind of missile that took off any place on the face of the earth, to ensuring, if God forbid we had to actually respond, that we could actually, the President could command and control all the nuclear forces. Those were the elements that really served as the foundation for the first quarter century in military space. And again, Corona was right at the front of this. I think many of you know, and we'll talk more about this in the course of the day here as we get some personal recollections, that you all recollect that before these technical wonderments came about, that we had things like U-2s that had to overfly the sovereign airspace of the Soviet Union. And this created a tremendous political calamity when one of those things gets shot down, or we find out we can't get access because of the vantage point of 60,000 feet is not like the vantage point of 200 miles. And so as a result of the conjunction of both this emerging technology, the development of the ballistic missiles that occurred when General Schriever began the Western Development Division here in 1954, that all of a sudden started bringing together both the imperative as well as the opportunity. The heart of this was the weapon system 117L, and we have the great pleasure to have the original director as well as the advocate behind 117L here with General Bill King. And it was really conceived around three fundamental capabilities that we know today. The Discoverer program, which was the Corona satellite program, SAMOS, as well as MIDAS, the missile warning satellite capability, were all concepts that were birthed in the early 1950s that with the transfer of the WS-117 program to the Western Development Division really brought about the opportunity to combine the space and missile capability, which to this day is still the foundation of what this organization is all about. Corona program was, after initial fits and starts and challenges and the rest of that, went on to 145 consecutive separate missions that were flown, as I said, between 1960 and 1972. What a remarkable string of successes and achievements. And I tell you what, though, that the real reason that all happened was not just simply the technical wonderment and the rest, but it really had to do with the leadership. We had champion leaders who are not here with us today that were at the forefront, people like General Benny Schriever, who really is the father of military space, as we are reminded every day as we pass before the Schriever statue out here in and now the Schriever Space Complex here in Los Angeles. We also had Colonel Lee Battles, the very first Discoverer Corona Program Office Director that stood up in 1958. But I tell you, although those gentlemen can't be here today, that we do have a group of people here that, no kidding, were there at the beginning. That were really the brains, the brawn, the thought leaders, the people with the indomitable spirit that ensured that the challenge that was laid out by the nation was going to be met. I've introduced each and every one, but let me just do so again. General Bill King, who was absolutely seminal in terms of the establishment of the Corona program and subsequently led a number of the satellite control network and facilities and all the test group operations, and was subsequently the director of special projects here up until his retirement in 1971. We introduced General Jack Culpa, one of my great heroes, mentors and bosses for many, many years back. A distinguished career all the way back from the early days of the space program, ran the original DMSP program, went on to become the director of special projects and had an enviable record in terms of mission success during his time in leadership positions. Great friend and mentor, General Don Hard, again, one of the great career-long space guys, although he did drive 130s every now and then, but we consider him a card-carrying member of the space community. Has done just about everything imaginable in the business, leading up to his culminating tours in the Pentagon, leading some very critical operations for the Air Force overall. Colonel Buzz Bazard, one of the three, the troika, the trio that with Lee Battles was part of the early on Corona program, getting it, if you will, off the drawing board, onto the rocket and into space. Talked about Colonel Bob Kleinman, who was a critical leader in terms of the satellite control operations. And when you think back about it, the world back in the 1950s was a whole lot bigger than it is today. We talk about a world today that over the internet and through air transport, you can get to anywhere and anything, either at the speed of light or at the speed of jet travel. Back then, it wasn't quite the same way when we had sites that were strung around the globe in some pretty desolate and remote places to ensure that we could actually operate these satellite systems. And the satellite control facility is one of the unsung heroes of the business that we know today. And again, one of the people I'm really indebted to, and I have to pay a special note of thanks here, is Colonel Dave Raspet, again, one of my former bosses, one of the great mentors and experts in this business. I'd like to acknowledge that virtually everything I know, but not everything he knows, I have to trace him in the space side of the business. Each of these individuals have answered the call and quite frankly put a huge amount of passion into what it is that they did, both back in the 60s and 70s, but as they continued on in the ensuing years in various capacities. We know that what they did is they faced an environment where you only get one chance to do it right. And yes, the trial and error method that we had to go through early on is one that we, no kidding, have learned from each and every time we have conducted a mission. And I tell you that also one of the parts of this is the development, as I mentioned, of the kind of teamwork between government and industry, between academia, suppliers, operators. A special kind of teamwork and brotherhood and sisterhood was created from very back in the very earliest days. I think that we'll hear more about some of the challenges and trials and tribulations that went into, no kidding, back in the 1950s and the 60s with Corona. Just think about this, of the 31st missions with the Corona program, there's only 12 that really had tangible, useful product that came out of them. And you sit and think today, would we have the tenacity, would we have the conviction and commitment to be able to conduct 30 missions, if you will, try 30, and have, if you will, the small numbers of real successes. But I tell you that it really is a remarkable testament, again, to the tenacity. I'll just relate one thing here that I had in the notes that was actually kind of an interesting little vignette. That apparently it turned out to be somewhat prophetic, naming the program Corona, because on one of the early missions was actually smearing that was going on in the film on board the satellite. And of course, as we now understand, trying to do forensics on an object that's in orbit when all you've got is a few discrete telemetry points and trying to figure out, so what the heck happened here? And lo and behold, that over a period of time and analysis, we're able to conclude that there was some electrostatic discharge and some parts and inadequate test chamber conditioning and the rest of that led to discharging that was in effect ruining the product that was coming out of the satellite system. It's through that kind of experience of in-depth technical forensics and finding different methods and design approaches and materials that finally allowed us to, no kidding, have the kind of predictable, reliable results that we now have come to expect on a day in and day out basis. That persistence and perseverance paid off in spades. If you take a look at the remarkable history that behind the first Discover satellite that was launched, in fact, it was the first polar orbiting satellite that had ever been launched. Likewise, it was, by the third satellite, it was the first successful ability to actually do 3-axis controlled stabilized platform on orbit. There's a whole series of things in terms of recovery of a deorbiting object and to be able to actually process the product out of it. And as I think everybody knows, it took 13 consecutive attempts before we had the first success. But boy, did it go on to do just amazing things. You'll hear more about some of the, it wasn't just the initial attempts, but it was how, to what degree we actually came to operationally employ the system for a whole myriad of different kinds of military applications, and I think that's one of the really remarkable parts of the story. So let me just try to bring this to a close because I know I'm standing between you all and lunch. But I will tell you that what it is that was accomplished from these early days have really become part of our DNA. We understand that in this business you don't get two chances to do it right. What has happened now is we have gone beyond the stage of just technical curiosities and achievements to a point where military forces, the public day in and day out, depend upon what it is we do from space, whether that be reconnaissance and surveillance, or how we assure communications, or how does GPS even make sure you get from wherever you came from to this luncheon today. These are capabilities that indeed the world has come to depend upon, and the spirit, the practices, the culture that was begun with the Corona program some 50 years ago are the bedrock of how it is we do our business today here at SMC. So again, let me just close off by thanking each and every one of you for being here. I look forward to both rousing discussion at tables and on the margins of the presentations. We got a lot of memorabilia out here that hopefully people get a chance to kind of peruse, some of which you were responsible for the creation of. And likewise, we're going to have a great panel discussion up here to kind of recount some of the personal recollections. But let me just say thank you very much for being here, for sharing with us some of your recollections and some of the history that may not have made it to all the textbooks and the histories thus far. And most importantly, thanks for sharing things with some of our young men and women our military space business. I thank you very much.
Thank you, General Hamill. With us today is Colonel Retired Dave Raspin, former Vice Director of the Secretary of the Air Force Special Projects. Introduce our panelists and moderate the discussion. Colonel Raspin.
Was totally new. Film, of course, if you expose it to vacuum, would lose all its properties. So you had to protect the film in some way. So there were huge technological obstacles in the process. And as General Hamill alluded to, there were a number of failures. Some of them were planned steps that like Discoverer 13, they didn't have any film, they didn't have a camera, they just were addressing the objective of recovery. But went from April of '58 to the first full success in August of 1960. That's 28 months talk about doing things anymore. So, General Cognitore's comment was 28 months is about the timeline for the failure investigation that was going on after the first one. Thank you, sir. So, again, I won't give that long an introduction to the rest of them, but Colonel Bazard, if you could talk for us about what it was like working for Lee Battle.
Well, first, I'm sure Bill Johnson will agree with me that 5 years of working for Lee was indeed an experience. He was very much his own man. He was very deft. The Battle's laws were not something that just conjured up. It was exactly the way we operated in the office. And so I thought maybe I'd just go through these briefly. Keep the small program office small and quick acting at all costs. Part of that was be schedule oriented. You got to keep the pressure on the people. You've got to schedule. You got to meet the schedule. And so you had to get the satellite down to the base, get the satellite on the pad, so on and so forth. Exercise extreme caution in selecting people and rely heavily on their personal attributes. And that says every guy in the office has to be productive. No managers need apply. We don't want nonsense. We want guys that work. And that's the way it ran. Make the greatest possible use of supporting organizations and make unreasonable demands. As anybody who was working elsewhere in AFBMD can assure you, that was exactly the way it was done. Now, it made my life kind of easy. They'd rather talk to me than talk to Battle, because, I mean, he could be fairly mean. And so we could go on and get things done in the other offices. Cut out all unnecessary paperwork. We did. We had none. No, seriously, it was wonderful in those days, but it made writing history absolutely impossible because there was no paper. Our office had zero amount of paper in the office. And control the contractor by personal contact. Each man in the office has a particular set of contractor contracts. It was never an adversarial relationship between us and the contractor. We were mutually engaged in something that was very important and very hard to do. Now, in essence, that says you run an espionage operation against the contractor's management team. And so I had some guys at Lockheed that I talked to daily, and I expected them to call me when there was any problem on the satellite or in the test and so on and so forth. Similarly, down at the launch base, I had some contacts down there that I talked to almost every day when we had a bird. We had a lot of them down there. And you know, one of the interesting things about always occurred at 2 o'clock in the morning. There were 3 words that were never spoken in the Discoverer office. One of them was obviously Corona. Corona was that funny little office down there somewhere. The other 2 words were random failure. And Battles said there is no such thing as a random failure. Every failure has a cause, and you have to find it or it'll come back and bite you. Now, there were 3 here, a little diversion. there were three heroes in the Corona program as far as I'm concerned. Mr. Bissell of the agency, Jim Plummer of Lockheed, and Lee Battle. And Jim worked and got promoted up at Lockheed, and so his replacement was a guy named Ray somebody or other. And we had a problem, and this guy came down to explain what the problem was. And so we were gathered in a little room, and he was telling it. And he opened up by saying it was a random failure of. We never did find out what it was a random failure of. Battle got up, stomped out of the room, slammed the door, called Lockheed and said, "This man does not have the proper attitude to be working on the Discoverer program. I don't ever want to see him again." and he disappeared into the bowels of Lockheed. And I finally, when I retired from the Air Force and taught for USC, I was sitting in the lobby of Building 104 up at Funnyville one day, and this guy walked out, and that was the first time I'd seen him. And I retired in '72, and this had to be sometime in '80 or '82. He'd been puttering around in Lockheed the entire time, but he never showed up on the Discoverer program again. Now, it was a very difficult thing to do a failure analysis on the Discoverer. That was a failure in the test system on the ground was fairly easy. But remember, we had limited telemetry, we had 3 tracking stations, we had no recorders that would work in space, and so the only telemetry that we got was when the bird was over a tracking station. And it'd be 5 minutes here and 8 minutes there, and so forth. We had 3 tracking stations. One at Vandenberg, one on Cody, Alaska, and one in Honolulu. So those stations would see us as we went around on our first revs, and then was dead for 6 times until we came 6 orbits until it came around, headed up north the other way. So you had a very limited amount of data to work on to figure out what the devil caused this failure. But he became quite adept at it, and we fixed a number of failures. Now, let me talk a little bit about, well, let me go along on this. Don't over-communicate with higher headquarters. And now, that was also strictly enforced. The instructions were, tell them what you want them to know, not what they want to know. And if you don't want them to know anything, don't tell them anything. He put me in charge of reports. And that was my instructions. Your instructions are, get a C- on that report. If you get anything, the important thing about any report is get it in on time, whether it says anything or not. And so get a C- and send it in. As I say, Battle was very much his own guy. Andrews, AFSC sent down a big decree. All program managers will report to Andrews on such and such a date to learn how to manage programs. Battle says, I don't have time to go listen to such claptrap. Buzz, you go. So I went off to AFSC with a bunch of other guys, and guy got up and talked all about this series of regs that was going to straighten everything out. And I came home, and he said, okay, you're it. And so you make all those reports. And I did. I got them in on time. They didn't say anything, but that was fine. Another funny thing about reports, we never relied on a report, a formal report from a contractor or the base on what had happened. By the time the report got to us on that basis, it had gone through the chain of command and been properly blessed by everybody. We wanted to know what was going on right now. And so that's why we had this espionage operation going on the whole time. Short word about reports. One of the big reports that was published by the launch base was the 45-day report. And that summarized everything that Vandenberg had done to the bird from the day it arrived there until the day it was launched. And it was about that thick, and it had a whole bunch of compilation of nonsense. And one of the reports a long time later, somewhere along the line, there was a line back about page 45 that says, anybody that's read this far and calls me up, I'll buy him a beer. and seriously. And it went on for weeks, and nobody ever called him. And finally, some guy who didn't have anything else to do read the report, and he said, did you see what they said on page 45? And he was deluged with calls then, wanting the beer. But, so, I guess that's exactly how we operated. Now, a little bit about our history. This contracts with Lockheed were signed in April of 1958. Lockheed had been working on a letter contract for some time on WS-117L, but this contract was signed in April of 1958. The bird was on the pad, ready for launch, in December of '58. They had finished the design, they bent the hardware, they tested it, they shipped it down to Vandenberg, and in December of '58 it was on the launch pad ready to go. For a variety of reasons, it did not go, but it was ready, and it actually tried. The first launch attempt was January 1959, and it was a particularly embarrassing failure. While the bird was still hooked up to the pad and all, the little separation rockets and explosive bolts, the explosive bolts that held the satellite to the booster, and the ullage rockets that moved the satellite away from the booster after booster burnout, fired when it was still on the launch pad. and so now you had a fully tanked, what later became the Agena, sitting on top of the Thor. Not a real good situation. So they detanked the Agena, and then they detanked the Thor, and then somebody got up and went up and bolted the Thor back, the Agena back on the Thor. And in those days, we would put the things together horizontally and then raised them like this on an erector. And so somebody had to go up and hook the thing back onto the Thor and then lower it down and so on and so forth. We scrapped the Agena. They took the Thor back over to Santa Monica. Douglas refurbished it, and sometime later we used it again. That was Discoverer 0. Discoverer 1 went off in the end of January 58, January something or other. And everything was wonderful. It just went off the pad and everything was great and so forth. And the Air Force made a big announcement that today the Air Force successfully launched the something Agena. Big problem. Nobody ever heard of it. It was on orbit, but it didn't show up at the tracking stations. It didn't show up anywhere. But we had announced that it was a successful launch. So we cobbled up all kinds of things. We contacted Jodrell Bank over in England and said, this thing should have gone through yours about such and such a time. Did you see anything strange? And they said, oh yeah, we saw it. And we called the fence up that Navy operated up in Colorado someplace. They said, oh yeah, we saw it. And various guys said they saw ionized tracks on their various things. And so we assumed that it indeed went into orbit. Probably didn't, but that's another story. Discoverer 2 was launched in late February, and it went into orbit very nicely, and it showed up over the tracking station, and we were delighted. Back to Discoverer 1. The reason we said it was on orbit was that we could track the satellite only halfway through the satellite burn. And everything was normal until halfway through. The assumption was if it was normal halfway through, it would be normal to the end. A bad assumption. And the data disappeared, blah, blah, blah. but we computed it anyhow. And so the solution to that was to put a tracking ship downrange. And they put a ship downrange that could get the telemetry and could track it, and that way we could tell for sure. Well, we knew Discoverer 2 was in orbit, and it showed up, and everybody was delighted. In those days, we had a clock on board the satellite, and it was adjustable to adjust to the period of the orbit. The actual period that we got on this was nominally 93 minutes. The one we actually got was about 90 minutes. So that thing's out of date. And so the Hawaiian tracking station was told, send 12 steps to go from 93 through 96 back down to 90. The step was 20 seconds worth of adjustment. Hawaii sent a bunch of steps, and then they lost count. So then they sent 12 more. And as a result, it went from 93 to 96 to 0 and back to 96. So we were 6 minutes out on every orbit. After it went away from Hawaii, we never heard from it again. But we were wrong by 6 minutes on every orbit. And so we figured out what's going to happen to this thing. We made all sorts of attempts to get telemetry and the like. We never could. The Security Service operated some tracking stations around in various places. And they couldn't contact it for us. We couldn't have said anything to it. We wanted to know what was going on. But you computed all the orbit out, and it said that instead of coming down close to Hawaii, it would come down close to Spitsbergen. Now that's a fairly long error. So then we got a hold of some guys, had some guys on Spitsbergen to go out and look for it. And they said, oh yeah, we saw that thing. And so if it came down at all, it came down in Spitsbergen. An interesting place. It's owned by Norway, but its half of it is contracted to the Russians, still today, to operate coal mine. And so the assumption was that this thing came down and the Russians went off and got it and took it away. And on that assumption, Moose Matheson conjured up a trip to Norway and got a helicopter. There were no helicopters really, and flew over Spitsbergen and saw a whole bunch of tracks in the snow and decided that it had come down in Spitsbergen. So that was Discoverer 2. 3 and 4 failed nicely. 3, we killed a bunch of mice. And we were going to fly mice and monkeys. We flew mice. We never did fly a monkey, primarily because, as Bill knows, we never could keep the monkey alive and the life support system on the ground. And he kept dying. And so, anyhow. So then we went back and we recomputed and boosted up the Thor a little bit. And we launched again in August of 1959, and another one in August of 1959. And one of those, we know the recovery capsules were separated from the Agena because instead of coming down, it went out. And so it's out floating around out there, and some 6 or 8 months later, it re-enters the atmosphere, and it triggers the Jodrell banks, and it triggers the fence at Colorado Springs, and there's great terror about mystery satellite appears over the United States. And when they computed all back, it turned out to be the recovery capsule from whatever it was. We called him Lonesome George, but he came back, and that was that. So we went on, and we had a total of 8 launches in 1959. Failed in a variety of ways. Never did we repeat a mistake. But one of the things that we learned very quickly was that they weren't really kicking at us too hard because the camera never worked. And the reason, so Battle and a guy named Red Shepard, who was General Schriever's #1 plotter, went up to Hollywood to guys who used film and said, what's with the film business? And the first question they asked was, what base are you using for the film? Well, we're using acetate. And they said, well, you dummies, acetate, when dried out, will crumble like autumn leaves. And you've got to coat polyester. And so Eastman Kodak learned to coat film on polyester, saran wrap essentially, and it got thinner and thinner and thinner. And that was the generation of a study that was called the autumn leaves study, which identified the film. Now the film was stronger than the camera, and on a couple of cases it pulled the camera kind of apart. Anyhow, 59 was not a good year. In 60 we launched 11 times, and on I guess it was number 11, which was sometime in February, March of 60, everything worked. The camera pulled a full load of film through. Everything was wonderful. The damn thing never came back. And so it just never re-entered. We heard all, now it's not back. So then we had to figure out what was wrong with the recovery system. In those days, we had no instrumentation on the capsule. We knew nothing about what was going on in the capsule. Once it had separated from the Agena, we knew it was gone. And that's all we knew. And the idea was, if you turned on your electronics prior to coming through the ionization layer, they would all burn out and they wouldn't work when they came out. So we didn't turn them on until it came out of the ionization layer. Big mistake. So we instrumented the capsule, put some telemetry on it to tell what happened, and put an S-band beacon on so we could track it with our good radar, and took it down to the launch pad, launched it. The damn Agena didn't work. It didn't go in orbit. So then that was number 12. We waited a little while longer, and on the recovery, so we rebuilt the recovery system and went from funny little spin rockets that spin it up and de-spin it to a cold gas spin system, which was fairly simple, and put it on board. And so on number 13, fired it off, it went in, it went off orbit, everything was lovely, and by golly, it separated just like it was supposed to, and it re-entered almost where it was supposed to off of Oahu. And it came down, and everybody was delighted, except the recovery crew got bad information, and they flew this way, and they should have flown that way. But the capsule came down, it floated on the water, the Navy picked it up, put it on the boat, brought it back. We brought the capsule back here to Sunnyvale. And we launched that thing on the 10th of August, 1960, and recovered it on the 11th of August, 1960. Everybody was delighted. All the wheels went off to Washington to meet the president and all that. Battle and Plummer and all those guys went off and met the president, and there's some pictures of it around somewhere. And the peons stayed out here and got ready to launch number 14. And we launched number 14 on the 11th of August. On the 10th of August, we launched it on the 18th of August, 1960. And it flew and did wonderful, and it took pictures, and came on the 12th of August, on the 19th of August, 1960. It came down. The guy who hadn't caught it when it was number 11, or 12, whatever it was down here in the Long John spot. He flew by, and he was going to catch it regardless of what happened. And he had a minimum altitude that he was not supposed to penetrate in catching it. But I strongly suspect that he was intent on catching that capsule, and he may have, it may have been almost in the water when he did it. Anyhow, brought it home, big hero, had all the film on board. Photography wasn't great, but it was photographs, and it covered a total amount of the Soviet Union. And we got more pictures of the Soviet Union on that one flight than on all the U-2 flights put together. So everybody was real happy, and off we went. And so we then continued to operate. We had failures, successes, and failures and successes. Can I have a couple of minutes, Bill? To Dave?
Why don't we take it in the comment section after?
Okay.
Let's get through the panel and
Okay.
go back. A couple of comments. Colonel Broussard made the point very well. We are here to a large extent celebrating the Air Force's participation in the Corona program. It was a covert program that involved significant CIA involvement. As Colonel Broussard made reference to, Richard Bissell probably was the senior partner in all those discussions. And from the CIA, he was the one President Eisenhower called when the failures occurred. So this is an celebration, Air Force participation. There is a significant element associated with CIA. I have one personal comment to make. I was very fortunate when I first came to LA to work in Space Systems, to work for Colonel Broussard. And I have to tell you, I never wrote a report. I never made a chart. But when he called me, I better know when that command system was going to get delivered. So we really did operate in accordance with battle rules. So with those two comments, I'd like to move on to General King. General King has been involved in the Space Systems. I'm sorry, one more comment about Colonel Broussard. Colonel Broussard is recognized as one of the pioneers of military space. And the next speaker, General King, was one of the 12 originally selected. That includes people like Schreiber and Ramo and Glasser and Terhune. So the 12 original pioneers. So General King has been involved in space since he was assigned to advocate it based on a RAND study from the early 50s. He has some interesting stories about advocating space in various places. He was a leader in Weapon System 117L. He was part of the selection board, selected Lockheed in 1956. And he went to the SEC, ran the SEC, and came down in and was director of special projects in his retirement. So General King, would you discuss your early involvement with space and the Corona program and space in general, sir?
Yeah, if you want me to. You know, I think, in all fairness, that all the good material related to the Corona program has already been provided to you by either Mike Hamill or Buzz. And so I'd like at first to ask, are there any questions, just to be sure? No questions. I wonder if I could ask a question. Of you people in uniform on active duty, do you all know what a satellite is? If you do, hold up your hand. Well, I see some that don't. Well, do you know how to spell satellite? You know, in the days I was working in this business, to spell satellite was one of the hardest things we had to do. And if I asked that same question I've asked you folks, what's a satellite? And when man held up his hand, more or less unacceptable to most of the people other than the very high people in the government, I have to admit, and many scientists and things. What we were called, those damn space weenies. But they did direct that the people at Wright Field set up an organization to go out and preach the gospel of the feedback reports, that you could get in space, you could do all these things. And it turned out that Hugh Reapy, one of the original guys, there are a lot of things I'd like to tell you about on that, but I won't tell you about all of them. Going to Hanscom, which comes to mind, it was a technical center or scientific center for the Air Force at the time. I don't know whether it is now or not. We had the dog and pony show, and we told them about it, but we did have the commander there, who was a brigadier general, as I recall, and when he finished, well, he came up to the podium when I finished speaking and asked what my schedule was for going home, or what plane was I on and such. He'd like to, if I had time, would I come in his office? And which, of course, I could. You know, I was flattered that we were invited in there because we'd been thrown out of someplace. And he looked at me and he said, "That's very interesting, but I do have a question for you. Why does that thing stay up there?" I don't know whether he's pulling my leg or not, but he asked it so sincerely, I'm not sure he did know why it would stay up there. So from then on, as we went around on the road pedaling this thing while we had a rock or weight on a string, we could get the forces together. But the bosses there were involved in the airplane business, the B-58 development. I think Sam Phillips was running that, B-52 mods and that sort of thing. They were paying attention to us all. It was a good thing there were about 7 of us in. We had a small office, but we had one secretary, but she could get travel orders to go anywhere, so we did. And Eventually, though, we realized that we had to get something better than the very junior people or people that didn't have anything else to do to listen to us. So the advertisement we put out when we were going around to get appointments was to, we're going to talk about the stuff that you need a Q clearance, and that was the Atomic Energy Committee clearance at the time. Well, of course, virtually nobody had a Q clearance. But it really, they began to think, and then we think we can handle it under top secret. Of course, nobody had top secret. So we went on down, well, finally we can handle everything we want to talk about confidentially. Well, all those guys thought we were going to foul it up, and I might say something we shouldn't say. But it was that kind of an environment. I want to make the point here. We got invited to go to SAC. Now, SAC with General LeMay were probably the most prominent general in the Air Force, most world-known officer in the Air Force at the time. And we took two of us went in to do the briefing, and one of them was Sid Green, and he made the point and talked 10 or 15 minutes about if we took the V-2s that were captured, and some of them were at Holloman and some of them were at White Sands, and with some of the rockets that were being developed for the fighter airplanes, we could put an orange-size satellite around our moon. Can you imagine how fantastic that was as an idea? Well, just as we were ready to start the briefing, and Sid was going to talk and give that message, somebody hollers attention, and in walks LeMay with 6 horse holders. And I then noticed that the front row was vacant, and so they sat down on the front row, and Sid gave the talk, and I went through the usual dog and pony show, and I thought he was listening. He had his head cocked, and then somebody hollered attention again, and he stood up, and everybody stood up, and he walks up the podium, and you know what he said to me? I'm going to thin this down a little bit for the benefit of the ladies. But he said, how'd you justify your TDY to come in and tell me such nonsense? The nonsense was a little differently placed. But General Estes, who was the boss there at Wright Field for us, who we hardly ever met, Messi was a kind of a protege of LeMay, and of course by the time we got home the word was back of what LeMay thought about what we were doing. Of course Estes had never listened or never heard anything at all, and this is career limiting to get into this kind of a situation. There were a number of situations like that. This was not a popular thing that was happening in trying to get into space. Finally, we got, well, there were a lot of other things. One, the only time I can remember, maybe one other time I can remember that Estes ever called me in. And of course I was scared to death, and I was standing there. He was a buck general, and he asked me if that was my name, and I said yes, and he threw this letter out on the front of his desk and said, I never want to get another letter like this. And it was a letter that apparently come down through channels from headquarters in Washington, and it was from the governor of Pennsylvania. I think the governor of Pennsylvania, I think it was Stanton was his name, and what it said in essence was that we understand you got people out on the road that say you can take pictures from any place you want to, of anything you want to. I want you, and the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania rejects this idea. And all I could say was, I never told anybody we were going to take pictures of Pennsylvania. But it was, we got invited also finally to go out to see General Schriever. We'd been out there, but we never got a chance to do anything other than just meet some friends and things. But before the Estes would let me go, he said, I want you to write down what you're going to say. I want you to read it. I don't want any more of your damn ad-libbing. Well, we did, in a few days, write up the Dog and Pony Show, and that thing was, and I did read it like I was supposed to, and the history, what was the fellow's name? It was, I can't remember the history man here, Rockefeller. Huh? Rockefeller. Yeah, Rockefeller, yeah. Dr. Rockefeller, well, he thought that was a good briefing. But when we finished, ARUC or whatever they call it back there in those days, who was in the development business. And so Schriever turned to Cy Ramo and said, what do you think, Cy? And Cy says, well, I think these people are probably on the right track, but he said, you know, if it's allowed to continue, you'll interfere with your program, and you have the highest priority in the nation in reporting to the president. And so we went home. Again, Estes got the message, but he got the message that said, transfer the program to the West Coast, all personnel, all funds, and so the next thing, that's the only time that Estes ever went to into this end of the business. And but it turned out that the Schriever and Estes, and there were 4 or 5 other, well, maybe a dozen people in the room, back and forth, and Estes would make a statement as to why you can't do that, and why, and well, one, we don't have any civil service people out here. And it bannered it back and forth, and finally, Schriever's secretary came in and handed him a note, and he read it, and she was all smiles, and he said, okay, I'll take care of this later. And you know what had happened? That message said, you've just been promoted out of the regular line to Major General. Estes was still a Brigadier General. You know, the discussion got so much easier, you know. Well, we at the meeting didn't know what it said. But, and I'm sure that I recognize that Schriever did become quite more accommodating. He said, well, he said, if the fellows want to get out of this civil service, I'll have Cy Ramo hire them. And he went through a lot of these things. Well, you don't need to send all the people. I realize that you may have good people you need back there that are on this thing, and it went on and on like that. But then when the meeting opened, opened the door, and here were 25 guys out there clapping and cheering for Schriever getting promoted. And that's a career limiting thing if you're a lieutenant colonel out all peddling the program. But the people did come come out here, and the 117L, one of the things that was a real problem, though, we had been given $2 million at right field to start, get a paid for offer to build this thing, or to do it, to get a plan for it. And the only thing that Schriever asked for was that we be able to send 2 guys out to kind of witness the final selection of the contractors from the 4 that we had. We're going to give each one of them $500,000 to write a proposal for how to do it. And so but the program did come out here. And 117L had, you know, the Midas, which became the DSP, and the space business. That's about all I can remember that these guys didn't tell you.
All right, well, thank you, sir. Thank you. And if you think about the process of sending satellites over there to take pictures, pretty quickly you realize that you probably don't want to take pictures of the cloud tops. And somebody in the program did recognize that, and in pursuit of that kind of objective, the program 417 was conceived as a covert program and run for a long time in that mode. General Culpa ran that program as program manager, and of course, General Culpa went on to serve 8 years as director of SASFP, longest serving director we had. So, General Culpa, could you talk about 417, excuse me.
417.
417, yes.
Yes, I will. Thank you, Dave. Am I live? Yeah. Okay, good. Actually, what I'll try to do is, since some of the people here may have a relationship to DMSP, 417 was the predecessor to DMSP, Defense Meteorological Satellite Program, and it has a history. And I'll briefly try to go through the history and not take too much time in it. The original weather satellites were identified at NASA. They were the Tyrant program. And it was a program that was small. The satellite was about 400 pounds, and it was inertially stabilized. And that means it was spinning like a top and going around the Earth. Well, it got pictures of the Earth, but every time it came across, the pictures were a swipe, and you couldn't control where they were, and they were very distorted. So when the NRO and the Corona program found that a lot of their pictures, some of their reels of film were as much as 60% cloud cover, they needed good information to allow them to know when to take a picture. And so a small group of Air Force officers got together and conceived of the idea that rather than spinning like a top, turn the satellite around and spin it like a wheel, and then put sensors on it, such that when you went from cold space to Earth, you got a signal. And you came around on the backside and went from space again. Take a picture and you're looking down. And that
had 2 contractor reps from the satellite manufacturer, and actually none from the launch vehicle, because the launch vehicle was an old Thor, came out of England, went to San Bernardino, was reworked, and used as a launch vehicle. Blocks 1 and 2 were that way. Block 3 was a little different bird. In the fall of 1964, that's it, 1964, in the fall of 1964, we were in a little involvement in Vietnam. And the bombers over there were going out and having to not find their targets because they were cloud cover, and they dropped their bombs over the water or any place that was supposedly safe. So it was conceived that why not be able to take pictures over Vietnam from space and use them for targeting. And that was the absolute first time that space was used in combat. And that's what we did. We took the same vehicle, and we put 3 cameras on it. 1 facing down, 1 to the right, and 1 to the left. So that every time we came any place close to Vietnam, we were able to take a picture. Sometimes it was distorted to the right, left, but you could see the clouds. We put a station in Tung San Nu, and we would directly radio down the pictures real time to the station in Vietnam, and then they would plan their missions based on the weather data they got at a particular point. And it worked. One interest about that, program director, and in December, Assistant Secretary of the Air Force, who was the DNRO, was my boss. The Director of Special Projects was my boss, and the Commander of Systems Command was my boss. Now that can be tough, but it also can be very good if you play your games right, because the right hand never knows what the left hand is doing, and you get to be able to do what you want to do. And what you have to do to make the schedule. Well, we started that in December. Between Christmas and New Year's, we negotiated a contract, had a handshake. We quit for New Year's Eve. On 2nd of January, we had a handshake. We didn't have a letter contract until the end of January. That's kind of illegal, but we turned on the contractor. And we actually were in operation, having built the station in Vietnam and having built a brand new satellite, having launched it, and we were operating on the 14th of May, 5 months. I don't think anybody, any place in the world, has ever been able to come close to that. Subsequently, the program went on and went to a 1-inch Vidicon on Block 4, and then we developed Block 5, which was the first line scan system, and a digital electronic readout. Our readouts were all analog. So brief history of the DMSP 417 program. Thank you.
I noticed you talked about 417 accepting refurb ballistic missiles.
Yes.
I don't think during your tenure as director of FSP, we accepted reworked ballistic missiles.
That is not exactly correct. Just digress a moment. We were supporting a sister service program, and that sister service decided they didn't have money, so they decided they were going to use Kansas Wheatfield Atlases, pull them out of the hole, refurbish them, and use them for launch.
Bob Mann and
Yes. Sorry, Dave.
So that wasn't your decision, that was the Navy's.
That was the Navy's decision. A little pat on the shoulder. I had the opportunity to be mission director on 50 launches, and one of those Navy ships was the only one that had a failure.
Yes, sir.
So it doesn't always work.
early days of SP-16.
Let me move on and talk just quickly about Bob Kleinman's career. Bob Kleinman is here based on his service as a field test force director. And those, any of us who've been around ops know FUTFUDs and their scope of action. When you think about the Corona program, it was a primary battery program, so it never flew more than 19 days. More likely the missions were on the order of a week. If problems came up, they had to be solved right now. Of course, all the activity taking the denied area occurred at night. And so you were under intense operational pressures. Get the problem solved, get this thing working, make it work. And it went on at night. And if you notice the film that's back there on display, that's a picture from Christmas 1965. You can bet the FUTFUD and his team were in there working ops through Christmas that time. So Colonel Kleinman was the FUTFUD for Corona in 1965, and just a little discussion of the ops tempo. Talk about that. In 1961, they launched 17 Coronas, supported those ops. By 1965, it was down to only 14 launches a year. What's General Hamill's record? 3 or 4 launches so far this year? Mike, how many launches have we got in LR?
This year?
This year. Two or three. So the ops tempo was very different. And again, I can't overemphasize the pressure that was on these FUTFUDs to keep operations going. So Colonel Kleinman, can you talk about what it was like at the SCF in the mid-60s?
Sure. I was associated with the SCF from 64 up through 69. The function that we performed as a FUTFUD, and a lot of people laugh when they hear that, but it was a much easier way to say Field Test Force Director. But we provided the interface to the users of the satellite control facility. This was usually a program office at Los Angeles. And we had several FUTFUDs, so each one of the program officers were represented by one of the agencies there. The actual interface that we provided was a command and control interface, a telemetry interface, and orbital evaluation. Telemetry phase activity and terminal phase activity. So all of the facilities that we had were made available to the program officers to accomplish whatever their missions were. We had about 12 different command stations, so that as we launched the missiles and satellites, they were controlled through these various command stations. One of the important things, of course, was to insert the mission requirements into the system. And this was done by another agency and provided that data to a function which was called command generation. And for those of you who have no idea about command generation, this was a group of valiant young officers who worked around the clock in stages to generate these commands. We had orbits that consisted of about 90 minutes. And as the satellite was going from station to station, these command generators, in their, at that time, antiquated situation, were using IBM 360s. We had several of them in there. And they would generate a message by using IBM 80 cards, which punch cards. And these individuals would take this time, use the telemetry that they had, generate the information about the orbit and whatever the commands were that were to be interjected into the systems, put them on these cards, and produce a tape message. That tape message was then run back again and verified so that we knew that it said what it was supposed to say. And then, at the time, sent out to a tracking station. The tracking station verified the receipt from the mission controllers. I think you saw a picture of mission control at the Satellite Test Center. And they held the command item until the satellite came into contact with the pass, and sometimes only a couple of minutes pass. The message was transmitted to the satellite, and then the important thing to do was to shut the thing off while it was going over the station so that it didn't leave the station in an operating mode. This type of activity went on for 6, 7, or 8 days, whatever the mission of the program was that we were working with. In connection with this, it was mentioned here by some of my cohorts that things usually happened at night, and that was no different at the Satellite Test Center than it was anyplace else. Although we were operating usually during maybe an 8 to 8 type schedule, the shifts went around 24 hours. The Footfoot's office had a few officers who would be present at command and control stations within the satellite control facility. These control stations provided the commander of systems command here and at the people at the Space Systems and the program directors a place to accommodate interpretation with their staff of what was coming across in the way of telemetry as it passed over one of the tracking stations. Itself brought in had to be adjusted to keep the satellites in orbit. So they, again, as a function of command generation, they would send telemetry messages back after they generated them to try and adjust the orbit. And we were operating with a screwdriver about 100 miles long and trying to keep these things going. The activities went about. The things never happened. You'd expect Earth to provide better telemetry, transmission, and the likes of such. The only thing about it was that instead of waiting until we got on the orbit, the command was spuriously generated, and as the satellite was being boosted into orbit, it dispensed the dipoles as it was going up. We found pretty soon that we had dipoles spread all around the Earth that were interfering with the telemetry that was being transmitted by ourselves, plus communications by people. That's kind of what happens when Murphy gets into the act. But there are other instances that only happen once, and we're glad that they didn't happen too often. After the systems were on orbit, and the commands and the other mission functions were accomplished, the people would collect the telemetry and make sure that anything that had to be upgraded on the system was put into future commands that were sent. As we got to the terminal phase system, which was the recovery of a capsule, we generated the functions to be performed by the satellites, transmitted them to the people, and then turned it over to the 6594th Recovery Control Group, who operated out of Hawaii. You can see the story all around us here about the C-119s and the C-130s and stuff capturing the satellites in their parachutes. I don't think I'll dwell with what types of things are that we did there. This was a combined function of contractor with Lockheed, our own Air Force people, and it went from the early stages to where we operated out of Palo Alto until the satellite control facility was constructed. We operated there at the inside of a building that had no windows on it, but finally we got our own power system so that when we had a power failure, it would not cause us to lose all contact with the satellite and wonder where the hell it went to. But that type of thing was taken care of by the generators and stuff. The next thing that happened for the satellite control facility was the construction of the so-called Blue Cube at Sunnyvale. And then that got outside of my span of control. And I finally left the satellite control facility in 1969. I don't think there's much else we can say at this time.
Thank you, Dr. Ryan. And our last speaker is Don Hard. Don's career began as a C-130 pilot. He went on to command the SCF. Is it called the SCF then, Don?
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
Yep.
satellite control. So many names for the same place. But it says here his final assignment was as Deputy Director of Plans. Of course, as a Major General, was Deputy Director of Plans, Office of Deputy Chief of Staff, Plans and Operations, Air Force Headquarters. Al Blankenship, are you still here? Yeah. Al, can you tell us what Captain Hard used to talk about when you would sit around discussing things?
He used to discuss the fact that if you weren't a fighter jockey, you could never make general.
So for any of you that didn't hear it, Captain Hard would lament at great length how a C-130 driver would never make general. That was for the fighter pilots. So, Don, you beat your own prediction there. Yeah. And now, obviously, if Buzz and his guys built the perfect satellite and the launch team got it off all right, and Colonel Kleinman did all his work properly and got those commands in at the last minute, it was all for naught if the recovery capsule wasn't captured properly. And so General Hard, can you talk about the recovery operation? And yes, you can use your hands to explain how.
Well, with that introduction, I'm almost speechless. Not quite, almost. First of all, I would say that as regards, the actual performance of aerial recovery, I'd defer to the real expertise in the room. I caught the last of the Corona buckets. The first one was much more challenging. The ones in between certainly were as well. We have people in the room that caught 12 at Bayer. Bud Gurney caught 3. So if you want to hear from the real experts about what it was like in the early days when it was a little bit harder, first to find, and then as we were improving the equipment to get it on board, I think you'd get a better story from them. And you can see from the pictures that it was just a piece of cake. I mean, you flew the airplane over the top of the parachute and caught it, and you had a reel in the back of the airplane. It was kind of like an automatic drag fishing reel, only much bigger. And as long as everything went right, it was a piece of cake. Every once in a while, things didn't go right, and we had those days. But I think it suffices to say that it was all about accuracy. So we did a lot of practice. It's kind of like a batting practice or going to the golf range. And so for every live recovery, it wasn't unusual for a recovery aircraft commander to get several hundred practice recoveries. And that became a very serious activity that was carefully recorded. We had a contract with Lockheed. A fellow by the name of Lou Bedwell from Lockheed was actually stationed with us in Hawaii and would process film that we used to record the recoveries. We would record what the parachute looked like as it came to the nose of the airplane, and more importantly, what it looked like when it went into the rig of the airplane. And within that, he could score. If you hit the parachute perfectly, it was what we called a 0-point recovery. It was neither 1 foot tight nor 1 foot loose nor 1 foot left or right. Just to give you an idea of what we're doing there now, at the point where the parachute hit the loop was about 100 feet behind the pilot's seat. And we typically averaged around 3-point recoveries. In fact, there was one gentleman over there by the name of Glenn Meserly that when we started betting beer on these things to make it a little more serious, managed to catch 6 recoveries with a total of 11 points. And now this was before we learned that 1.1414 was the hypotenuse. So a 2-point recovery was actually less than 2 feet circular error probability. So it suffices to say that we got pretty accurate, we got pretty good. 145 missions for Corona. There were other missions as well. The test group in its history over 3 decades made about 300 recoveries. Of those unexplained aerial recoveries, there's probably only a handful. Can't divulge the exact number, but we can at least account for the fact that there were several that were picked up from the water. And yes, we operated helicopters. We also operated ships. We had our own little Navy over there for a while when we operated H-3s. And then after we converted from H-3s to H-53s with a C-130 tanker to go along with it, we picked up, because we had gotten those assets from the rescue service, we picked up the rescue mission. It's interesting to note that with all the records that the test group and test squadron had, one of the finest records was their records of recoveries, or rescues, excuse me. And it went all the way from bringing burned sailors off the Forrestal when it had a fire to picking up people lost in sailboats to doing all manner of things. And in fact, we lost a crew and a helicopter in that business. So the test group had a pretty remarkable record of history, I think, and I'd like to just take a moment. I'm only focusing on the test group because that's what I was asked to speak about, but there are other operators here too that we thought fondly of, including the command generators, including the FITFUDs and the weather folks. We got the DMSP support to pick which area we're going to make the recovery in. In fact, that last recovery that of the Corona that I happened to get was just because I was the lucky guy on the east side of the islands. We had bad weather that day, so we sent 4 airplanes east 4 airplanes west. Don Crump was supposed to have gotten that recovery, and I got it instead. But within the operations and the mission and the priority, there was also an exercise of what we called selective assignment, which is to say that everybody that went to the test squadron and the test group came there after the records had been screened and was checked off with a good seal of, or the seal of good housekeeping. I would tell you that that pays off in spades, because within my tours there, I watched an organization that, sure, it grew up in a special environment. The 6593rd was really doing a unique mission, and there were a lot of unique rules that were made for it. By the time we closed the outfit down as a 6594th Test Group in 1986, we had aspired to normal operations as you would observe them in the Air Force. It wasn't quite so specialized anymore. And although there was a lot of fanfare in the early days about recovery, we tried to keep that pretty much low-key in the later days. We simply acknowledged that we were supporting classified Western Test Range activities and didn't say much more. But on the other hand, when it came time to compete, I think the test group was as competitive an organization as I've ever had the pleasure to work with, and certainly within a very competitive program. Not trying to detract from the other elements of the Corona program, but on the other hand, when you look at the kinds of awards that we were receiving by the time we closed it down, it included presidential acknowledgement of our performance. We had routinely competed in Air Force Systems Command's PACAF kinds of levels for Junior Officers of the Quarter, Maintenance Officer of the Year, and so forth. And just in 1 year when I was over there as commander, we had 3 that won Air Force awards for their performance. So I think that was pretty special. The other thing that was of interest is that when we retired the group, we received the Coast Guard Outstanding Unit Award for the support that we had done in the rescue business. I think maybe one of the best examples of how competitive the group was, however, in addition to winning all the intramural sports on Hickam, and absolutely winning all the parties everywhere, we had a board for selection for Chief Master Sergeant in 1986, and there were 17 Senior Master Sergeants that were up for that promotion, 11 of which were promoted. So you figure in the Air Force, maybe it's what, 10–15%, and then you compare it to that kind of a percentage, and I think it says a lot for the group and the squadron. You know, I think that all in all, the Corona program and within it the recovery activities sort of gave a little bit different definition of what we routinely hear in sports slogans and in advertisements of "just do it." I think the motto probably was extended to just do it, but do it better. Everybody thought that they had to make things a little bit better in their assignment, and they did. And over the years, it sure paid off. You've heard how we did things in remarkably short time then. I think the tooth-to-tail ratio was much better than it is now. I would submit that we did about 25 pounds of doing for every pound of planning, not the other way around. And that certainly paid off, but it took great leaders, it took great followers, and it was all the way from not just the pilots over in the test group, but also to the command generators, the administrative staff, the back-end crews, the engineers, the maintenance officers, and on and on and on. Many of whom are represented here today, are participating today. And I would urge all of you to take this into the back part of your brain somewhere, or maybe the front part, and ask yourself how you would project that same kind of spirit forward in today's programs in terms of don't just do it better. And so that's about all the comments I have today.
Thanks, Tom. I think the way we're going forward is we're going to take a break just as soon as I make my last comments, and then we're going to come back and while Captain Bannock says we're gonna be done at 3 o'clock, we're not gonna be done at 3 o'clock. We can stay in here and keep going. So what we'll do again is take a break in just a minute. I did want to provide a few more summary comments. You did hear that 145 Corona missions, 120 of those were judged to be full or partial successes. So all the discussion of the early program where there were a lot of failures, let me tell you, they learned how to do it and they did it very well through the program. We talk about photography. Corona took a total of 557 million square nautical miles of coverage. The denied area, Russia and China, constitutes about 11 million square nautical miles. So Corona covered that equivalent of 50 times. That's a lot of photography. And it was all very important photography. If you'll bear with me, I have a long quote from President Johnson. And I have to admit, the quote may be a little inaccurate because there was a lot of bourbon that night, but the reports come out of it, and it says something like this. I wouldn't want to be quoted on this, but we've spent $35 to $40 billion on the space program. And if nothing else had come from it except knowledge we've gained from space photography, it would be worth 10 times what the whole program cost. So he's saying it was worth $400 billion at a time when $1 billion was real money. Because tonight, and it was late at night and there was a lot of bourbon, because tonight we know how many missiles the enemy has, and it turned out our guesses were way off. We were doing things we didn't need to do. We were building things we didn't need to build. We were harboring fears we didn't need to harbor. Because of satellites, I know how many missiles the enemy has. So that is some summary of the contributions of the Corona program.
Dave?
Yeah.
Let me say one thing. Just along that same line. The first thing, turn on. The national intelligence estimate before the U-2 was that in the 60s, the Soviet Union would have between 200 and 250 IBMs. After the first U-2 flights, that came down to 150 to 200. After the first 3 successful Corona missions, that came down to be between 10 and 25. And now we actually know the real number was 6. So all that was as a result of the things that we did. Okay, thanks.
Don Frisbee, you want to come up and tell us about what
L building. Now, every building on Vandenberg had a number except the L building, because it really didn't exist. This is where we ran all for payloads. And we did Argon, we did Lanyard, they all came through the building. And in reality, this is where we conceived the factory pad concept. I don't know if we're doing that today. This was not out of just sitting on our hands and thinking about it philosophically. This was a necessity, because, how can I say this? How many women are in here? We all know what slides downhill, and it ended up at Vandenberg. So we needed to do a lot of polishing of the Thors. We built a big MAV down there. They were stacked up like cordwood. The Aeginas came down very months ahead of time. And in particular, the KH-4s, they came down 90 days ahead of time. We had cameras and buckets and sections and film stacked up throughout the building. So this is where the romance of the payload was done. And I got in there in '63 and left in '69, and I think I saw about 85 or 90 of them go through the building. It was interesting. They didn't talk much about the payload, but it was after it had to go through 5 90-degree turns before it got into the buckets. Not only that, but it had to go through the second RV, come back out of it, and go into the first RV. So when I grew up, we had window shades on the window. You know, you pull them down, you try to get up get them back up, and they go cattywampus. It would get off the rollers, and it was a real engineer's. The RVs, put in the retro rockets, put them in parachutes, the beacons, tested the beacons. And one of the problems that we had up there, before we got in there was nobody in the Air Force at the launch pad that was in this building. And I forgot to mention the fact that the KH-4s came down from Palo Alto was, that was in, when we went across the long side of the Dumbarton Bridge, driven me around the block because, but anyhow, Hiller was then taken over by Fairchild. ITEX went off from Fairchild, and so they were involved, and that's where the cameras were. So we had, in the KH-4, there were actually 5 cameras. There were 2 counter-rotating panoramic cameras, 2 stellar cameras, and an index camera. I wasn't sure what all those were doing, but I think those index and the panoramic and the stellar cameras, it was sort of like, where the hell are we when we took the picture? I think that's what it was trying to do. Anyway, that's probably enough for the payload section. We romance the payload there, and that was, there was a lot of problems about whether it was spliced right. We had to splice the film, take out the test film, and then put the real film in. So this had to be done in a dark room. You couldn't see your hand in front of your face. But everybody remember Dr. Strangelove, Slim Pickens riding out of B-52 Bombay? That's how we spliced the film. You had to get up and straddle that thing, reach down, pull the film out, and put these splices in, and then reel it back in. We had some other peculiar things out there. As I remember, the Thor, later Bell Telephone did the inertial guidance system, but originally it was done by AC spark plugs. And we invented the twang test. Now, I wasn't involved in this, but wanted to understand if the gyro systems were actually working, so we tied a rope and went out in the countdown and pulled on that rope, and it twanged against the vehicle. The guidance system shook and said, it's alive. So, I know, these were some of the, I'll just tell you some other experiences I had. There was a big worry because this was a film return system, so so we launched it. We had a payload recovery team. Gave me a hard hat, a pickup truck, and a box of, let's call them glad bags, just in case to go out there and pick this film up. And they also gave me a I forgot what kind of a suit, protective suit, because we had the hypergauss in the Agena vehicle, which was ERFNA and UMDH, unsymmetrical dihydrazine. Yes, bad stuff.
Just a second, huh? Did you come with all these?
Yeah.
Impromptu?
I was going to challenge, well, one of the things I did. These were my questions. I've got the questions on here.
You can sit down and ask the question.
Well, no, I was going to say, what was really going on at the time that drove a lot of this. We came out of I don't want to get too far. We came out of the Korean War. We came out of China now, 1949. We had a policy of containment. We moved into the Korean War, came out of that in 1953. Then was massive retaliation. Somewhere down the line, a little later, I found out the policy was we're going to fight 2.5 wars, one in Asia, one in Europe, and one like Iraq, I guess. And somewhere around 57, obviously Schriever was here in 54, but in 50, it was 55. Ike, President Eisenhower, put out the Open Skies policy, and he introduced that, and and about a year later, Khrushchev got up and pounded on the, and I don't remember, Buzz will tell me it was a lectern or a podium, but anyhow, and said, "We will bury you." And that was so much for the for flying the friendly skies. And I think that really brought on the U-2 program, brought on the Corona program, and off we went. Lockheed got the contract to build a surveillance system. CIA had control of all of the intel, and off we went.
Don?
There were 17 cards in the business tag. All right, I'm going to ask Bob Christian to tell us some of his B.D. White stories. B.D. White was the director of engineering in the Corona program in the late 60s.
Can I tell a Don Thursby story?
How long is it going to take?
A couple. Launched unsuccessfully, and the vehicle, among other things, crashed into some sergeants' trailers that they lived in. And so Don was put in charge of coming up with an emergency plan in case it was ever happened again. And he worked it down to the finest point that he could, and said that in an emergency you might have to use a local telephone. And in the write-up he wrote, put a map together where all the telephone booths were downrange. And finally, in the last page, he put in a 25% piece taped into the last page so that whoever was in charge of the recovery would have the money to use the telephone booth. Don was an upperclassman in our ROTC detachment. He remembered me when he first saw me at the old building. B.D. White was a director of engineering, as Dave said, and quite a colorful character. And the story, I'm going to tell the story. There's so many B.D. White stories that you don't know where to start and stop. But the one that Dave Raspet likes is the one that occurred. There was a club card drawing on Wednesday nights at the Officers Club. It was free beer and club card drawing. And they pulled one number every week. And it was a day of a launch, a Corona program launch. And BD and company had been at Vandenberg for the launch, and they were up at the STC trying to catch the first pass. And it was about the time that the club card drawing occurred in the Officers Club, and whose number was pulled but B.D. White. So I called B.D. White on the phone because I knew where he was, and told him, ha, guess whose number was pulled tonight? And B.D. White said, "Christian, if you're telling the truth, I'm going to kill you. And if you're lying to me, I'm going to murder you." And the part that Dave Raspet likes the most is that B.D. White was my boss, and I was not in town for the next 6 months on any Wednesday night. Is that it, Dave?
Yes, that's
Well, without any questions, I'm going to start prodding the panel myself. Oh, there, Jim Grogan, please, sir.
Let me ask one. I don't know if you know the answer, but during the Eisenhower time, where he was making decisions on not only the space programs but the ballistic missile programs, he had an aversion to putting key industry, military industry activity near the coast, and that was from his World War II experience of making it vulnerable to submarines and other things. He eventually relented, and he allowed, obviously, the aerospace industry to grow up here on the West Coast. Does anybody on the panel know how that decision came about in the Schriever time period? Because both the Corona program as well as the ballistic missile programs were all affected by that decision.
Anybody understand that one? Sorry, Jim. Buzz, can you tell the McNamara story?
Oh, no. As I say, Battle said, don't over communicate with higher headquarters. And so on one of our launches, later on down the line, the Thor misbehaved badly, and Douglas was very open about it and said, hey, look, we screwed up, we did this, we did that, the other thing wrong, we're going to fix it. Somehow that word got back to Washington, and some guy got it, and went in, this was obviously after the election, went into Mr. McNamara, who was Secretary of Defense, and he said, I want to charge Douglas money for the failed launch because of their negligence. And the guy sent a message out here saying, Secretary McNamara wants to charge Douglas for the failed negligence, so on and so forth. Please provide the necessary information. I asked Battle what to do, and he said, throw it away. So I did. Oh, 3 or 4 weeks later, some guy shows up from out in Washington, and he came in and he said, I'm here to collect the data for Secretary McNamara to charge Douglas. Battle wouldn't talk to him. He said, go away, I don't have time to mess with you. And the guy went away, and so Mr. McNamara never did charge. Well, as I said, it was mutual. The accident, the failure investigations were never punitive. Once they became punitive, then people concealed information. As long as they were open and you were working to find out what went wrong, you got free exchange of information. But Battle just told this guy, well, he didn't even talk to him. The guy sat around for a while, finally gave up, went back to Washington. That took care of that.
Yeah, Don, you got how many cards have you got before you ask this question?
I think I want to answer his question, and that is, why did it come out here to the West Coast? Wasn't that your question?
What made Eisenhower change his policy to allow it to come out here?
Well, they needed, first of all, they needed a launch site. Vandenberg, remember, was an old Army base, and that's where keeping World War II prisoners up there, German and Italian. So it was essentially a defunct. The Army gave us 64,000 acres up there. And it was a good place to go into polar orbit because it stuck out. You didn't have to go over a lot of towns to launch. SAC was already in there. The 1st Missile Division was up there at Vandenberg. Was there a General Cody up there that manned that? That was in the really early 50s. And then the obvious other reason was there were a heck of a lot of aircraft companies out here on the West Coast. Lockheed was up there at Burbank with their Skunk Works. Convair, General Dynamics was down in San Diego. North American was here. Douglas was here. Northrop? Right. So, I mean, this is a place where it was happening. I don't have any other reason.
Again, barring questions from the floor, I'm going to prod the panel for a while here. And what I'd like to hear from the panel is what's the biggest risk you took as a lieutenant colonel or major? Or what's the toughest decisions you made? I'm sorry, Meredith, what's the point? Oh, you have a question. Oh, my goodness.
Good.
Sean?
Hi, I'm Captain Figueroa from the Launch and Range Wing. Just had a quick question for Colonel Bazard. You mentioned when you were talking about, you mentioned mice and monkeys. I was wondering if you were kidding, and if you were not kidding, what did that have to do with Corona?
Well, that was part of the cover program. That was part of the cover program, that we're going to conduct biomedical experiments, and that was the reason for the capsule and so on to come back. And as I say, we actually flew some mice, and and we also could not keep the monkey alive in the life support system here on the ground. Oh, Bill tells an interesting story about that. They put him in the capsule in the life support system, and they wanted to take a picture of his face, but his belly was in the way. So they put a mirror up here so that they could take a picture of him in the mirror and so on and so forth. But he didn't like that mirror up there, so he'd take his feces and spear the mirror, so couldn't see it. But as I say, that went by the boards, and we never did monkey around with the monkeys. Another thing about the monkeys, they were rhesus monkeys, and rhesus monkeys were sacred to the Taos Indians. I mean, the Indians. And so we had to make sure that these were American monkeys, because we didn't want to get in any trouble with the Indians, because we were using Indian monkeys, and so we had to certify the pedigree of these crazy monkeys that we sent down to GE. I'm not the monkey story.
Yeah, Sean, it was all involved in the cover story. If you think about it, why are you bringing something back? Right? It was hard to get a story that said we need to bring something back. And so they flew mice. And it went through a number of iterations. There's stories in history about all of a sudden all the relative humidity sensors in the capsule went to 100%. Well, the mice were urinating all over the place, and it was short out the electronics. There are stories that they use some commercially available absorbents to contain the mice, and finally they made mechanical mice that would put out a telemetry signal that looked like something was around.
Precise.
So again, it was part of the cover story, but that's one of the extremes they went to in supporting the security application.
Actually, it was followed up. There were some NASA missions in which they flew monkeys. You may have read about those. And those capsules were supposed to be recovered by the test group. And I don't think, well, I'm pretty sure we didn't have a 100% success record on them, right?
That was a NASA biosatellite program.
Yeah, the monkey's name was Bonnie, I remember that.
It was a copy of Discovery Apple.
Yeah.
Yes, sir. And for the panel, could I return to my question that says, what's the toughest decision you made as a lieutenant colonel, major, captain, or what's the biggest risk you took in that vein? What kind of decisions, what kind of risks were you taking as a junior officer? Don's going to start because I warned him ahead of time.
Oh, okay.
But we'll take you in a minute, General Coleman.
Yeah, I think I can talk about a career limiting risk, but I'd also tell you that this only applies for my space experience and not for my airplane driving experience, because they had the luxury of taking risk there all the time. Let's see, how shall I start? The interesting risk that I took as a young officer out here, my first assignment out here was about coming up on 45 years this summer, and I started off in the Satellite Control Facility Equipment Support Division. I quickly got picked up for first the Dinosaur program and then the Manned Orbiting Laboratory program. While I was working in the Manned Orbiting Laboratory, I worked for a fellow by the name of Joseph Patrick O'Toole. Some of you may recognize that name. FitFud of great esteem in the Corona program. In fact, I was trying to talk Pat into coming out here for this. At any rate, I was working fat, dumb, and happy in the operations section, trying to figure out how to do recovery operations plan. That's where I first got involved with the test group. This was before I went to pilot training. And Pat O'Toole pulled me aside one morning and said, Hard, you're going to be asked up to General Berg. General Berg at that time Russ Berg was running the MOL program. General Connolly isn't here anymore, I guess, or Colonel Connolly, he would tell you more about this. So he's going to ask you, Hard, if you want to be his aide, and you don't want to be any damn aide, so you just tell him to go to hell. Okay, yes, sir. So I walk up to the general's office, and sure enough, he invites me into his office. He says, Hard, I want you to be my aide. What do you think of that? And I said, go to hell, sir. And he looks at me, he says, that damn O'Toole got to you already. And I was not selected to be the aide.
Yes, sir, General Coleman. You had to.
Oh. One of our 417 launches, Thor, while we still had the blockhouse near the pad with Slick 2, Space Launch Complex 2, and the blockhouse was maybe 3/4 of a mile away from the pad, and the way we launched the Thors were we fueled them. Well, we processed them horizontally, raised them up to a vertical position. Well, pulled the garage shell off of it first, then raised them up and fueled them with kerosene, and then went in with liquid oxygen when you got up to 99%. Then you went into the last part of your countdown. Well, everything went very fine on this launch. Got up to 90%, and we automatically pressed the button, and on the television cameras you could see the flame come out, but no roar. There was no noise whatsoever. Wind came and blew the smoke away, and what had happened was we had a hot bird up there and all the igniters had gone off. Well, we didn't have a procedure for that. Absolutely no procedure. So I scratched my head, and first thing I said, nobody go out of the blockhouse. Everybody's locked in the blockhouse. Secondly, call back and tell the guards not to let anybody in the area, because we had a big bomb there. Then we had to safe the missile, and that was a hard decision, because somebody had to go out there and put the plug in. And that is not easy. At night, kind of windy, cold, you know how it gets along Vandenberg. And so our chief master sergeant, who really ran the pad, Roger Stovall, said, I know this bird better than anybody, and I am obviously the guy to do it. Well, my training at West Point said that the leader always goes out and does it. But I didn't know a damn thing about how to put the plug in. So we let Roger go out, he got the plug in, we defueled, well, dumped the oxidizer, just dumped it, defueled, put it down, found out that it was just a little micro switch. Changed the micro switch, launched the next day, and that satellite had an MMD of 9 months, and it lasted 4 years.
What was your grade at the time?
Lieutenant Colonel.
He was a lieutenant colonel, made those kind of decisions at that time. Yeah, Jim.
Let me try another one. The boosters that you used, were any of these pulled back from Europe that had stood alert, or were they all brand new out of the factory?
We used some that were pulled back out of England. I don't know that we used any that were pulled back out of Turkey, because I don't know whether there were any. And they were probably stopped before they were ever put in there. But yes, we did use Thors that were pulled back out of England.
Don, oh yeah, excuse me, Don, go ahead.
Well, the only answer I can give you, I think General Cuttle spoke that way, but shortly after Cage 4 came in, we got the J1 cameras, got a lot heavier, and we had to go to the thrust augmented Thorad. And I don't think those came out of England or Italy.
They were new.
And then we moved on to what they called the long tank TAT to take the J3 cameras. So I think those were all manufactured.
Yes.
Okay. Can I continue my question about risks or tough decisions as a junior officer? Not a junior officer, but lieutenant colonel of low rank. Bud, did you make any tough decisions?
Well, as I say, when we started out, nobody knew nothing. I mean, and so, you know, what? The unknown unknowns were the world. And so I guess, I don't know, I can't think of any real tough decisions about what to do. It was do whatever's necessary to get this doggone bird on the pad. And when it got on orbit, do whatever's necessary to get it back. And I can't think of any particular tough thing that we had to do.
Did you ever get crosswise with Battle? Did Battle ever chew you out? Yeah, you, Colonel Bizarre.
What?
Did Colonel Battle ever chew you out? Did you ever get crosswise with him? Did you ever do anything that he didn't approve of?
I didn't hear you, Dave.
Did you? I think this is an accident. I'm trying to ask if you ever did anything that Colonel Battle disapproved of. Did he ever chew you out? Did he ever reprimand you? Did you have any difficulties with Colonel Battle?
Well, frankly, no. And the reason was, well, I very early learned that when you went in to see him with a proposal, you gave him the very best argument that you could. And if he said no, you said fine and left. Now, sometimes he would come back and say later on, yeah, that's a good idea, but not very often. And so we did what he wanted to do, and that was that. I can't ever remember how. I don't remember any particular decision. Normally, when I did something, he said, "Okay." Let me give you kind of an example. The week before Memorial Day, Battle and his family always disappeared. They backpacked up in Tuolumne Meadows up in Yosemite. And my instruction, and the instructions were, if you need to get a hold of me, call Ranger Station such and such in Yosemite, and I'll call you back maybe. And so he went off, and pretty soon, and we had a launch coming up, and so I called him to find out what he wanted me to do, and he finally came on, and he said, "What did you decide to do?" And I said, "I decided to do this, this, this." And he said, "Fine, go ahead and do it. Then I'll be down 3 or 4 days. Bye." And that was that. Other people tried to argue with him, and that was a disastrous affair. And I know 2 or 3 people that got into great big arguments with him, and later on wished they hadn't. Okay?
Colonel Kleinman, you operated in a very pressure-intense environment. Did you ever make any decisions you regretted? Did you ever get crossways with anybody up there?
Based upon program security, I refuse to answer that.
Good answer.
All right. Dane's giving me the hook over here, but I did want to tell one more. Bob told one of the B.D. White stories, and we have B.D. White stories, the veracity of which I wouldn't necessarily swear by, but they're part of the folklore of the Corona program. And one of them goes about a particular launch. And y'all know that before Six Sigma, before TQM, we had 0 defects. You remember all the way back to 0 defects. And there was this Thor that went out and it got down to Baja and went into the water. And so you have to send an airplane out when something crashes in the water like that, because you want to make sure you haven't left any navigation hazards, right? So they put Colonel White in the airplane, and he flies down there to look around and see what's going on, what's out there. So he comes back, and everybody rushes up to the airplane, and they ask, well, B.D., what did you see down there? What's going on? He said, the only thing I saw down there was this great big 0 defect sticker floating in the water. Like I said, I don't swear by the authenticity of any of the B.D. White stories, but Bob could tell you a bunch of them and more around. Now, this is one, we always are a little reluctant to come and talk about the way we used to do things, because we don't want the junior officers following that example. But B.D. was in a big, long discussion with Lockheed about whether this particular box should fly or not. Lockheed said the box was flight worthy. Colonel White didn't think it was. And so he says, let's go down and look at the box. So they walk downstairs, and there was a box on the test table. B.D. looks at the box, and he picks it up and looks at it. Boom! It drops on the floor. He says, I don't think we're going to fly that one. Again, please. All right. General Hamill, you had a presentation to make here, sir, if you could.
Forgot about, I was supposed to say something about the oral history, and I forgot to.
Oh.
Maybe you can.
Okay. Well, first of all, I will tell you all that I guarantee, and I know you all believe this, I would much prefer having spent the past 2 hours with you all as comparing to over-communicating with higher headquarters. Unfortunately, where I'm in. I am absolutely confident, based upon where I rejoined here and the rest of that, has been a great discussion. And particularly great news is that we've been able to capture all of this on video, and hopefully it'll become kind of part of the history and the folklore, if you will, that we've captured some things here that we've never really been able to do before. One of the things that Don Hart passed me a note here that I wanted to make sure everybody understood is that as we've talked about here, what's really critical is to be able to capture some of the original history. Some of that is in documents and facts, others are in personal recollections. And each and every one of the people that have been part of this wonderful adventure, if you will, has personal recollections. And our historian here, Dr. Harry Waldron, has the ability to be able to work with anybody that would care to do a bit of an oral history about some of the periods of time that they have worked in the business here at SMC, SP, at the launch bases, back in the Pentagon. Because again, this really is the grist of how it is that in future generations we're going to be able to really tell the full story, much of which I think is still clouded in secrecy and in people's minds. And as Colonel Bizard said, that we were mandated not to write anything down, so it makes it a little bit hard to recreate some of this. So please get in touch. You can do it through Dave Sutton to be able to connect up with Dr. Harry Waldron if you would be interested in being able to provide a bit of oral history for this. One of the things we wanted to do is make sure that we had some appropriate recognition of both the time, the preparation, and also to recognize each one of the members that joined in the panel today. And so we do have a bit of a memento here for each person. One of the things we've made a bit of a tradition here at SMC is we refer to as you got your Crummy Squadron plaque, but we got our Crummy SMC Scroll plaque. But the idea here is to be able to recognize each of the individuals. And so if you can maybe give me one, I'll read the inscription on it, and remarkably, they're all the same. So let me just say that to each of our honored guests and participants in this, and it basically says, presented to each individual for Air Force Corona Program, April 1958 to May 1972. The inscription says, with sincere appreciation for your outstanding contributions to the Air Force Corona Program. Your dedication and contributions in pioneering space systems development and operations, as well as your technical leadership and vision, have helped preserve our nation's security through one of the most critical periods of our history. Your efforts directly contributed to the security of the nation and continue to have lasting impact on all future space capabilities. The men and women of the Space and Missile Systems Center are indebted to you for your service and proud to continue your legacy. So if I could, here starting off with the top, Don, if I could present this to you and to Major General Retired Don Hart. Why don't we step over here if we can so that we can catch this. Very pleased to be able to do this. He does that great. Good, thank you. General Kolpa. When did I think, back when I was a young, impudent major and lieutenant colonel, that I would be presenting a plaque of appreciation to General Kolpa. Sir, thank you very much, and personally for the things you've done for me. Well, this will make it great how we are. It's too late for me. All right, General King. Sure. I might trouble you to step up here. The Godfather.
It's a long way over.
The Godfather. Long walk. But thank you very much, sir. I know you got a few things around your house, but hopefully Mary will like it. Well, I'm sorry I missed some of your thing, your talk. And hopefully you didn't give too many bad ideas to our young officers. Thank you. Colonel Kleinman, please. Thank you much. Moderator and another one of my mentors here. Come over here. Okay. one closing thing before we kind of get wrapped up here. And it's very, very serendipitous as we now mark the 50th anniversary of the beginning of what was arguably one of the seminal programs of our national security space business. And as we kind of look forward to the future, one of the things we had a chance to talk a little bit about at the table over lunch with General Kulba is sort of the lament about how it is over time we've seen sort of a fracturing and fragmentation of our businesses. We've reorganized and realigned. And one of the things we've really been working hard in the recent past here is to try to bring together different parts of the, if you will, the extended Air Force space family, kind of spanning the different organizations. And I think everybody's probably aware that we now have SMC as part of Air Force Space Command, so that we really do, if you will, that cradle-to-grave kind of business all the way from initial operating requirements and concepts of operation to how do we build and field and sustain and operate the systems, all part of Air Force Space Command. And likewise, we're strengthening some of our relationships, again, with the National Reconnaissance Office, and although we're on opposite coasts, the fact is that still over half of the people serving inside the NRO are United States Air Force people. And part of what we're trying to do is to get lots more cross-flow back and forth, both from more junior grades as well as to the senior-most levels. And pointed out that General Tom Sheridan, many of which you know Tom, will be succeeding me here in a few weeks. And oh, by the way, my current Vice Commander, Ellen Polakowski, is going to head back east to replace Tom Sheridan as the Deputy Director in the National Reconnaissance Office. The message of all this is we're making good progress and, in fact, trying to restore some of the structure and the culture, if you will, that so many people up here were really responsible for creating in the first place. And I think one of the really exciting things that's happening here now as being part of Air Force Space Command is that each year, many of you may be aware, sort of back to the history of Strategic Air Command, they used to have a thing called Olympic Arena, that every year they would bring in each of the missile crews to Vandenberg and actually have a competition for the outstanding missile operations crew and the best missile operations wing. Well, since we did some reorganization and realignment, Air Force Space Command has continued that tradition, and now we call it Guardian Challenge. And every year we have a competition for the outstanding space launch wing and space operations wing and missile wings and the rest of that. And for the first time this year, Air Force Space Command has agreed that we need to have in the competition also the outstanding systems wing from SMC. And we've recently conducted some competitions, and we still probably got a long ways to go to figure out how do you define who is the best systems wing. But we brought together some of our bright young people to really, no kidding, go nose to nose with their competitors and counterparts to really identify who are the most forward-thinking, innovative, and talented systems wings inside of Air Force Space Command at SMC here. And that competition and final results are going to be announced here in the May, I think it's actually on May 9th in Colorado Springs. So we've kind of come full roundabout in that whole competition, and our participation in it is going to bring back a very, very tight Air Force family. But when you do that, you also have to figure out, so what the heck is it that we're going to do for a trophy for this outstanding systems wing? And today we have a whole series of trophies, the Schriever Trophy, and we have the Aldrich Trophy, and the Mormon Trophy, and the Blanchard Trophy. And so the first thing we had to do is figure out, so what the heck are we going to do for naming a trophy to recognize the outstanding systems wing in SMC and Air Force Space Command? And we've been kind of going round and round for a little bit, trying to figure out who should that be. Who should we name the trophy after to recognize the outstanding space wing? Now, easy choice would be General Schriever, because he started the whole business. Guess what? His name was already taken, so we already have a Schriever Trophy. So what we had to do is to probably pick what we thought was the best exemplar, if you will, of that pioneering spirit, the individual that, no kidding, exemplifies and was there at the creation and was critical in terms of our business in space inside of Air Force Space Command and SMC. So we have yet not quite completed all the paperwork, but General Kaler said it was okay for me to make this announcement that we will, for the first time, have the inaugural award of the General Bill King Trophy to the outstanding systems wing of Air Force Space Command. I can't think of anybody that is more deserving, that represents the best of what this business is all about, irreverence and all, but that's part of our DNA, sir, and I'm very, very pleased that we will forever memorialize your contributions, and it'll be tagged to the Outstanding Systems Wing in Air Force Space Command from this year forward. So thank you very much, and hopefully it's okay to use your name. With that, thank you everybody for making time and joining in. As I say, I think this has been very valuable for all the attendees. And again, hopefully this is just a continuation of our continued quest to re-establish and reconnect between the earlier generations and the future generations, because this is something that our nation depends upon for its very security on a day in and day out basis. And we are indebted for all that you've done in the past. And as I look at our young folks here, that we're depending upon you for the future. So thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us today for this very special luncheon. Please rise for the playing of the Air Force song and the departure of the official party.
Everybody's expected to sing also.
While singing.
Thank you and have a good day.